Welcome to the latest edition of HCTV. As various jurisdictions grapple with the effects of the latest outbreaks of COVID-19, there's been a clear policy shift towards reopening the economy with reliance on vaccination milestones, rather than the blunt instrument of lockdowns. Some employers looking to avoid the dislocation and interruptions associated with any lockdowns in the future have perhaps not surprisingly looked to embrace mandatory vaccination protocols for their staff. SPC was a first mover in this space, and Qantas is also considering a mandatory vaccination policy, given the severe impact that COVID outbreaks have had on the aviation and tourist industries to date. This is a complex issue and an emotive issue, as seen by the recent unrest in the construction sector in Melbourne. It involves a confluence of health orders, workplace relations laws, workplace health and safety, liability and privacy laws, and will be a consideration for many workplaces across the country. Joining me to unpack this rapidly evolving area is workplace relations specialist from Wotton Kearney Lawyers, Caitilin Watson. Good morning, Caitilin.
Good morning, Blair. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem at all. Listen, as a starting point, what employees in what industries are subject to a mandatory vaccination policy as we speak?
That's a good place to start. Thanks very much for the introduction. So at the moment, our industries are healthcare workers, aged care facilities, education and care workers, and that includes disability workers, the police force, construction, quarantine workers, no surprise there, transport workers and airport workers. And in Victoria, it's a similar set of workers: healthcare, residential aged care, education and care, construction, public service. So at the moment, as you might have seen, the state of play in New South Wales and Victoria is that the state governments have enacted these public health orders. So that's how this is applying. And the way those orders work is really their directions to staff not to undertake work unless they've had vaccinations. And they've got a specific time schedule. So there's a first dose by the 30th September, which we know is already gone, and a second dose by the 30th November. And there's also exemptions in place as well. So for instance, there's some flexibility around the timing if employees can arrange to have that vaccination, because there's been some supply issues in some areas, particularly regional areas. There's also an exemption for individuals with a medical contraindication certificate. So that's really the medical basis upon which employees, or some employees, might resist or not be able to have a vaccination because it might be harmful to them. You might be aware as well that these public health orders are currently being challenged in a few of the states. So at the moment before the courts, for instance, in New South Wales, we have the Kassam challenge against the Health Minister, Bradley Hazzard, and Mr. Kassam's a construction worker. There's also one in the aged care industry at the moment from Ms. Henry as well. And both of those are being heard together just this week before the Chief Judge in the common law list, Justice Beach Jones. So certainly a hot issue and it's fast changing environment.
Okay, so if a workplace isn't subject to a mandatory health order, can a mandatory vaccination policy be implemented?
And that's it. That's the million-dollar question that we're getting at the moment. We're having lots of conversations about. I do have to give you the worst lawyery answer first, and that's it depends. It's not a one size fits all. So maybe some background, I suppose, is the National Cabinet, as we know, came out and said that they weren't going to implement a decision requiring employees to be vaccinated, and they left it deliberately as a matter for individual businesses to take into account their own particular circumstances. And I suppose this might have been met with some sighs by employers and employees, because it leaves the position a lot less clear. So there's not a specific section of the Act of the Fair Work, for instance, that I can say, look, that's where you must have a mandatory vaccination policy that needs to be implemented. So instead, it's working, as we say, industry by industry, employer by employer. And then what we're trying to understand at the moment is, where is the line? And the way that's worked out at the moment is through challenges to policies. So as you mentioned in the start, which I think is really helpful, some companies have come out in front. SPC, my understanding is they've already been in discussions with Victoria's WorkSafe as well, and that they're still having ongoing discussions from the public statements. I'm not involved in that matter. A couple of law firms have also come out in front and said that they're going to take an approach of putting in mandatory vaccination policy into their firm. And of course, any employer that's coming out that isn't involved in a public health order will be taking some risk, of course, that there'll be a legal challenge to the policy and that it will be tested. And so for the moment, we don't know exactly what they'll say, but we're trying to take some guidance from previous cases, because of course, vaccinations aren't new, and a lot of the older cases were about influenza vaccinations, your flu vaccination that you might have every year. So I suppose some factors that will be taken into account, which I think helps to think through about whether an employer can implement this policy, is what's the nature of the workforce? What's this workplace? What are the employees that you have? What are their roles? What are their duties? It will matter what's the extent of the community transmission in the environment, the availability and the ability and also the effectiveness of vaccines. So at the moment, while there's the Delta variant, that's an issue that's come into play. And of course, whether or not any employee has a legitimate reason for not being vaccinated. I thought I might talk briefly about one of the cases that came out quite recently on the 27th of September, Kimber and Sapphire Coast Community Aged Care. And this is an interesting one that came out because it was the sort of case we can expect to see for employers if their policies are being tested. It was one in the aged care sector. So, and it did relate to a public health order from March last year. Now, March last year, we obviously didn't have any of the COVID vaccines at the moment. We'd had the flu vaccination, and that's what this is about. And so when the outbreak of COVID was first coming into play in the Australian jurisdiction, was a public health order relating to the aged care sector that required staff to get the flu vaccination, just the usual flu vac. And this was implemented by this aged care facility. And it's an interesting case to read because it does step through a lot of the issues that we'll see coming up. And I won't bore you through everything, but in effect, the worker who was involved, Ms. Kimber, said that she was someone who needed a medical exception and that she wouldn't be able to have the vaccine. And part of the case went through scrutinising the medical evidence, and she provided a letter of support from both a GP and also a Chinese medical practitioner. And ultimately, the majority of the court that decided that decision in an appeal at the Fair Work Commission decided that that neither of those medical documents that she provided were sufficient to demonstrate that she couldn't have the vaccine. There was also evidence as well from a specialist immunologist, and I can expect that there'd be more of that in any coming cases. It just talks about generally the effectiveness of vaccines and particularly vulnerability of certain community members, in particular in this one, aged care. And so it was an interesting matter because they went through, it took some months of communication with this worker. They went through and said, look, we require you to have the vaccine. It's a reasonable and lawful direction. And that's what you'll hear a lot about in relation to vaccines, particularly mandatory vaccination policies. It's possible for employers in their common business, just the usual day-to-day business, to be providing directions to employees. The directions might be to implement work in a certain way. And that's where these policies are coming out, and that's what we're seeing. In this one, they said this is a lawful direction. It was also reasonable to obtain a vaccine, for that to be a flu vac, and that she wasn't able to undertake the inherent requirements of her role without having had that vaccination. And her role was as a receptionist at the aged care. There's obviously close association with the public. There's visitors attending, and also the aged care, the people that live there. So that was one that came up as an unfair dismissal matter. And ultimately, the appeal decided that she wasn't unfairly dismissed and that she wasn't granted her relief to seek reinstatement to get her job back. So that might just give a bit of an indication of how sometimes these cases might play out.
Yeah, I guess it does depend would depend degree from industry to industry.
Mm.
But under federal and state workplace health and safety laws, employers are under an obligation to, so far as reasonably practical, ensure the health and safety of their employees and persons of the workplace. Can this legislation be relied upon to introduce a mandatory vaccination requirement? And indeed, does it effectively mandate COVID-19 vaccination?
That's a great question. I think that's going to be coming up a bit. So I think, firstly, there's been some guidance already from Safe Work Australia. It's publicly stated that most employers will not need to make vaccinations mandatory in order to meet their health and safety obligations. So that's an interesting point to come out straight away from Safe Work. But you're right, for some workplaces, the answer might be yes, but for others, no. So to give a little bit more context, in the New South Wales context, it's the Work Health and Safety Act that provides this requirement to provide a safe work environment. And the primary duty for employers and business is to ensure health and safety so far as is reasonably practicable. And they do that by eliminating risks to health and safety. Of course, not all risks can be eliminated. So if it's not reasonable, then the risk must be minimised. And that's so far as is reasonably practicable. So you can hear the reasonable words coming up a lot again in this context. So how that really works in practice is employers need to consider what the risks are in the workplace. So in this context we're talking about, it's potentially the risk of transmission of COVID in the workplace, which is of course quite a serious concern given the public health information and the medical advice we're being given on what can happen if individuals do transmit and contract COVID. So that's the identifiable risk. And then it's thinking through and taking a really practical assessment for businesses to say, what can I do to eliminate this risk? Can it be eliminated? Probably not. So what can we do to, as far as possible, minimise the risk? And that's what we've seen already. You would have seen this through 2020 as well. A lot of businesses have been doing increased cleaning, increased hygiene. There's quite a shift culturally in ensuring that employees do not attend work if they have any symptoms that might be COVID, and that's perhaps a difference that we've seen in the Australian market. And so that's one of the safety provisions as well. There's a number of other steps they can take, and that's where, again, this mandatory vaccination policy might come into it. Do they need to have this policy in order to reduce the risk? And then we'll come back again to those factors that we talked about before, is thinking through, well, what are the employees' roles? What's the nature of the work? Is it a public-facing role, for instance? So there's going to be a difference, we think, between how hospitality and retail workers in traditional shop fronts and pubs that are reopening soon, their risk is a little bit different to potentially, for instance, office workers who perhaps in an office work environment, there is possible to do more social distancing. There's less contact with the public. So that might mean there's a distinction, we think, between those two environments. And there's already been some cases to indicate that if social distancing isn't possible, then those are the industries where it's more likely that a mandatory vaccination policy will be able to be upheld and that the courts will allow that.
So I think you might have answered this question already to a degree. Are employees protected by fair work legislation if they refuse to be vaccinated? I suppose the short answer is it depends.
Unfortunately, it depends. But for some employees, no, they won't be protected. The Fair Work Act, as we said, it hasn't provided a blanket protection to refuse vaccination. So, and that's a decision by the governments at the start, state and federal. No blanket protection for employees to make that decision. In terms of attending work, quite different again to just living in New South Wales. And again, we've had some public comments already been made by the Fair Work Ombudsman, and it said that it thinks, for its 2 cents, that the employers will need to have a compelling reason before they require vaccinations. And it's gone so far as to say the overwhelming majority of employers should assume that they can't require their employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. So that's a pretty impressive and quite a large statement that's been coming out. But of course, it is a changing environment, and it does depend on the public's willingness and how much opposition there is, what the courts find in the decisions. And then ultimately, in other cases, as we've seen, then it might mean that there'll be legislation that follows through. But in terms of our current legislation and currently what the position is, we'd expect to see some resistance, or some employees might say that they are protected and they don't have to, they're allowed to refuse the vaccination on the basis of disability grounds. And so, as you probably know, there's lots of disability discrimination protection to ensure that there isn't discrimination. And that's also under the Fair Work Act, as well as, for instance, the Disability Discrimination Act. And there's already been, in some of the decisions, there's already been some mention in comments that there's the expectation that might apply for employees. And disability is quite broadly defined. For instance, it includes the presence in a body of organisms capable of causing disease or illness. So capable of causing disease or illness is quite broad. And for those individuals, they're protected, for instance, from employers taking adverse action or adverse steps against them. And whilst that's a technical sort of protection, in essence, it means adverse steps could also include a direction to get vaccinated and to not attend work unless you are vaccinated. So if there's, again, there might be that medical basis on the disability grounds as well. So there's a few different ways this might play out.
So I guess a further question is, and it's a supplementary question, is are employees entitled to request employee vaccination status information from their employees, and what are the privacy law implications of that?
This is also possibly an important change, I suppose, for employers. Most employers already have a privacy policy, and some employers, of course, would have done a sort of set and forget approach where they have the privacy policy, it's done, but it's not usually coming up for them every day. This is a time where that'll become probably a little bit more important. So it's a good time for employers to think about checking that they have the privacy policy in place. And if they're doing it's a bit old, doesn't need to be updated, because this is when it's going to come into play. Yes, employers can request employee vaccination status, but I would say that under the Privacy Act, it's certainly personal information, and it's also classified as sensitive information under that Act, which has a different level of protection under the Privacy Act. So what that means is really the Privacy Act at a really high level is really concentrated around businesses being required to be transparent and communicate in terms of how they're collecting, how they're holding, and how they're using personal information and sensitive information. It's also important to consider the purpose as well for which that will be used, because there might be more than one purpose. So the purpose might be initially, can they return to work? And that's why I'm requesting the vaccination status. But employers should also be a little bit careful that there's no other purposes, even if they're secondary purposes, or just check that they're also permissible under the privacy principles. So you're right, there's some complexity there. I'd also note that because it is, or at least I think it is sensitive information, that also means that if the employers are not being covered by public health orders or another law, then we think that they will be requiring consent from employees to collect that information. So there does need to be that communication piece and consent provided. So yeah, it's certainly something that if it hasn't been thought through already, it's definitely one of the steps for employers to be thinking about in relation to the vaccination status.
And one imagines this is going to have to be an ongoing sort of an updating record keeping sort of system, because one imagines that you're going to have to be revaccinated or have boosters going forward.
Yes, exactly. Booster shots.
Well, can employees refuse to come to work if their colleagues haven't been vaccinated? And what about potential customers?
Oh, I think that's an important thing to consider. A lot of what we hear initially is about refusals to be vaccinated, but you're quite right. There will also be a section of the working population that will be considering, well, am I comfortable returning to work if the employer can't tell me that all the other workers or the people in my workplace have been vaccinated? So part of that will come back to the safe work environment assessment that we were talking about before. But it's, it will be an issue that employers need to confront and think about. Have they taken all of those steps that we talked through to be able to minimise the risk? And part of that as well is the communication piece with employees. So if we're hearing hesitancy about that, it might not just be the rights-based that the employer's approach would like to take, and they can go through that process, of course, but also in terms of communication piece of bringing employees back to the office.
So, do you have any recommendations for those employees who might be looking to implement a mandatory vaccination policy at the workplace?
Well, first of all, that's definitely one to get legal advice on at the moment. And you don't always need legal advice for every policy, but at the moment, obviously, we're in the current environment is changing, and we're talking about workplace specific. It's evolving quickly. But I can make some general comments that might assist for employers who are considering that. And it's going back to what we've talked about already. But first of all, there's that the step of assessment step, and that's thinking through, well, who are the employees that I have? What are the roles that they do? Are they public-facing roles? That's a really important factor. Are there customers coming in? Are there clients coming in? Is it possible to achieve social distancing at work? And that's a real question, because in some office environments, that might be entirely possible. If they've got the space, they might be able to even have the 4 square metre rule in some environments. Some employers might have a divide between employees, where some that are quite public-facing roles, and then others that might be able to have less public-facing roles and really can be quite confined, and it's less risk for those employees. So firstly, there's that assessment consideration process. And again, so far in the cases, it's looking like the more likely it is that employees are in public-facing roles and social distancing can't be achieved, then the more likely it is that a mandatory vaccination policy will be upheld and will be permitted. Also go through that process we talked about, the safe work environment assessment, and really looking at identify firstly the risk, which might be the risk of employees contracting COVID in the workplace, and are there any other related risks that you identify, and then going through that practical assessment. As we say, it's really trying to be pragmatic about it. What things can the employer do to reduce the risk, and what's the expense associated with them? If it's particularly inexpensive, then of course it's more likely that it's expected that the employer would take those steps, particularly in circumstances where the potential harm is quite great on what we know of the medical evidence about COVID. Of course, another step you're going to need to do is draft the policy. That might be something that you already have. It might be something that needs work or needs help from other lawyers. Ensure that it's practical, and some general tips about policies are, it doesn't always help to have an incredibly lengthy policy. It's really helpful when it's fairly concise. when it's on point, when it's practical, when anyone can understand it, when they can read it just on the face of it. We don't want it to be in overly legal language. Run a sense check through it as well. There's no point making your policies for your workplace be things that you just know won't be complied with. You're really setting yourself up to fail to take that approach. Instead, we want it to be a policy that you think that's practical, that can work, and then think about, of course, the next step, communicating it. How are you going to roll it out? A lot of the time, if it's a policy where you think there'll be some sensitivity, and it seems to me that vaccination does seem to bring out sensitivities for people, then perhaps a verbal communication first. It doesn't need to be a big song and dance. It can be, if you're having Monday meetings still, even if they're a Zoom or a dial-in meeting, perhaps there'll be some verbal communication, ensure that, of course, it's consistent across the business. So if it's a small business, you can do it sort of when you're having the group all together. With larger businesses, it might be that you want to coordinate it so that it's happening across the Monday morning. You might want to introduce it verbally and say, look, we are going to have, this is going to be our policy. I'm sure you're interested to know what our stance is, kind of walk it through. And then, of course, shortly afterwards, usually you'd want to be able to be in a position to be able to circulate that policy. And then think through the other steps. Often when these policies are rolled out, you might expect that there'll be some questions. It depends. If you've got a highly unionised workforce, then perhaps you expect those questions to come from union representatives. But if not, it might be that they'll be going to HR or people and culture. And so if you know that that's going to happen, always a good idea to have a frequently asked questions already prepared, just to alleviate the pressure from the person that's going to be answering those questions and keep it consistent. So that's always a good step as well. The next step that we've seen in the cases is really procedural fairness, which is that natural justice concept. And that's thinking through, if you do have some employees that sort of are resisting, and particularly if they've got medical basis or medical grounds that needs to be a further discussion, then take the time with that to step it through. Rushing won't be of assistance. The last thing you want to do is look like it's been implemented without consideration, without dignity and respect for whatever that person's concerns might be. But that's often the case if you're managing illness and injury at work with workers.
So it seems like the whole thing, this will be very much determined on a case-by-case basis. So, and it probably leads to the question: would you recommend a mandatory or a voluntary scheme? And I suppose a number of what you've already dealt with is what would best practice look like for a voluntary scheme.
Yeah, that's right. So I'd still say, if you're looking at a voluntary scheme, I still think you should take those assessments. I think it's important, obviously, for your requirements to provide a safe work environment. You want to be doing that anyway. But also in terms of communicating with your employees, and for all those other cultural issues that we sort of mentioned, in terms of keeping the cohesion in the workforce. We are seeing quite a lot of stressed employees at the moment, so it's a good time to be communicating with them anyway. But you're right, I think case by case, but think about what's my industry, what's the reality for my workers. If it's in the areas with public health orders, then those businesses can have a pretty good degree of confidence in implementing a mandatory vaccination policy if they want. And what we mean by that is a direction, a lawful and reasonable direction to be vaccinated in order to attend work. That's the purpose. In others, it's really going to come down to what's that level of risk for the workers. And one of those key factors will be, well, how much contact with others do they have? How much can social distancing be implemented? For some, it might be quite easy. If it is quite easy to implement social distancing, then it's going to be difficult to put a mandatory vaccination policy in place as a very rough rule of thumb. So those ones are the ones where we might consider it, less confidence in putting it through. The other factor for employers is your degree of appetite for risk. So some employers, as we've seen, SPC is a good example, obviously got a comfortable risk appetite to meet those challenges and to continue on. Perhaps the construction industry is also a really good example that you mentioned as well. Usually quite a robust work environment, and that's fine. And we'll see how this progresses as well, because of course, in some industries, it's just standard to be having certain vaccinations in order to be able to go to work, and it is a no jab, no work industry. So that is possible, but otherwise with a voluntary scheme, I'd still take the same steps. There's no kind of way to not think about it at all, I suppose, for employers. But we'd hope that there'll be a few more decisions coming down relatively soon. And then after a period, there'll be a lot more confidence for employers in going forward.
Okay, as I said, this is a rapidly evolving area, and it's certainly a case of watch this space. But thanks very much for your time, Caitilin. Thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure. Anytime.
Okay, that brings us to an end of this edition of HCTV. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.